On this episode, I'm joined by Alexa Kumiko Hatanaka. This is a landmark year for Alexa. She's showcasing her work in the 61st edition of the Venice Biennale this year. And on this episode, we speak about art as an invitation to speak about mental health, rethinking neurodivergence, vulnerability as an artistic practice, and the ideas of the materiality that she uses within her work, traditional papermaking, and how embodied knowledge is embedded in her work. Let's dive into my next episode with Alexa Kumiko Hatanaka.
My name is Alexa Kumiko Hatanaka. I'm a visual artist. Sometimes I'm also doing collaborative performances. Most of my work recently is around themes of mental health, my experiences personally, and reflections more broadly. And I'm also very much interested in embodied knowledge. And one of the major threads of that is working with traditional materials and methods, mostly surrounding traditional paper.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining me on an episode of Everything is Connected. I'm really looking forward to chatting with you today. So I'd love to jump right in. This is a really big year for you. Your work is included in this year's 61st edition of the Venice Biennial. And it's always a really big moment for an artist when their work is showcased on the world stage in such a way. Millions of people get to see your work and they get to engage with it. Could you talk a little bit about that experience and maybe share some of the most surprising things that have come out of, let's start with the work, just the creation of that body of work that's being showcased in Venice now. What was most surprising to you in making this new body of work?
What was most surprising to me? So the work I'm showing in the Venice Biennial, some of the pieces already existed, but they're recently created. There's a few things I made that were new. There's 2 sculptures that are situated on the ground. And then there's 7 pretty massive flags that line the walkway to the central pavilion. So it's the first thing that you see when you enter the Giardini, which is an incredible honor. And it's been quite surreal for that work in general, because you can't help but walk past it. You can't help but engage with it, kind of akin to public art, which was the beginning of my career, actually. I was doing mostly public art for many years. So I've always appreciated that level of encounter and on that scale to someone's body and experience. So that's been really, really special. And it feels, in a way, when people enter, they're guided into this procession that they're all participating in. So to your point, I don't actually know the number of people that go, but the many, many, many thousands of people are all connected in that way, which I think is really beautiful. That piece in general was a challenge for me because my work is very much based in process. And for that, I had to make decisions in advance, of course, because I had to work with fabricators that were sewing these large pieces together and preparing them in a way that it would last for half a year. So usually when I'm making work, which is what I did for the other pieces in the biennial, I have almost kind of my own personal archive. So I'm working with traditional papers, mostly from Japan, which is called washi. And they're naturally dyed or ink drawn them, or I'm practicing various forms of printmaking. I mostly do linocut printmaking, so that's carving out of the material linoleum, sometimes wood as well. And then you print the uppermost surface of that material. Or another form of printmaking that I do a lot is called gyotaku, which is the direct printing of real fish, but it's non-toxic. So I always cook it or eat it afterwards. And so I have all these different papers kind of around, and I'm also saving the scraps as I'm using them, because what I'm doing is sewing these into pieces, bringing together all these elements that I've made in different places that I've spent time in and different times. Even some of the scraps are 5 years old or 6 years old, so they keep evolving to the piece. All to say, I have a general sense of what I want to make, but it's always happened in the process. So making those flags for the Venice Biennale, which I titled Susceptibility to Gravity, was very unusual for me, but I enjoy a challenge. And it was exciting because I got to, meet new people through the process, which is such a pleasure of being an artist. So I worked with folks that sew sails at a place called North Sails. And this was nearby Toronto, which is where I'm from. And so I got to engage with people who have this very specific expertise, and it also felt very relevant being in Venice for them to be made by sailmakers. And they did feature this type of permitting that I was explaining that I do, but of course they were kind of enlarged to a scale that they've never experienced as specifically the fish. It's blown up to a 5-foot long fish from a small crate. So it was interesting to see these elements of my work expressed in that way. And yeah, for me, it's really exciting because, as I was explaining, a lot of the work I'm making now is really with a motivation to encourage dialogue around mental health. I live with a condition called bipolar. I wrestle with the full name, which is bipolar disorder, but we can get, more into that later, of my feelings around language, which I think is really important. But so, of course, for as many people that will be engaging with the work, which in many ways, this is the art exhibition that arguably the most people will attend, is a dream come true, because I want to communicate, right? And I want to start these conversations. And I think, as I've experienced when I'm physically present with the work and having conversations, I think being the one to speak about mental health first and kind of say the thing first, talk about loneliness first, talk about these things that so many people are experiencing, but still feels difficult to speak about, is kind of an invitation. And then I really notice that people open up, and it's almost this relief to be able to talk about it. So that's what I'll say about that for now.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many jumping off points. There's so many places and threads that we can pick up on. But maybe we'll start with what you said most recently, which is the fact that you named this experience that you live with, which is being bipolar. You spoke about disorder and how language is very important. In your experience with living with it and discovering it within yourself, and maybe learning more about its origins, its histories, because we've had some conversations, and I've heard you speak also publicly about the learnings that came out of understanding and knowing when you were bipolar, like having that awareness of oneself, and how you went down, I'll call it a proverbial rabbit hole. You may call it something else, but going down a rabbit hole to learn more about what it means and its history and some of the things that have happened. So what was that process like for you of learning more about what knowledge and what information is available about bipolar disorder and how it's impacted your ability to live with it, thrive within it, and more deeply understand yourself and, I guess, potentially others as well?
Thank you for that question. Something to think a lot about. So bipolar is very difficult to diagnose because usually in the beginning, it's expressed more so as depression. And so, unfortunately, actually, if you get prescribed antidepressants, it's very likely that you'll be pushed into mania. So it actually messes you up quite a bit to be improperly diagnosed, improperly medicated. But for me, I wasn't diagnosed until 2022. So that's, a fairly recent time and well into adulthood. And now reflecting back, as I know more information, it makes a lot of sense. And now it seems very, very obvious. Things like in children, sometimes it expresses itself as insomnia. So I actually had insomnia from age 12 to 21, which is bonkers. And it was a deep struggle, but I think there's certain mental health conditions that are still more stigmatized, and bipolar is one of them. But certainly when I was growing up, there was really not that much discussion or information. And I found it was so stigmatized that it was an immediate rejection. Like, that can't possibly be me. Because I remember filling out a form the first time I got really depressed in my doctor's office. And I hate these forms. I filled out so many. And these initial assessments where you have like 10 questions and you write on a scale, and that's supposed to capture your entire life experience. And then they make a decision. So I wasn't actually properly diagnosed then, I'll just say. But I did get diagnosed in 2022 because what is referred to as episodes, I had a much more obvious manic episode, which had never happened before. When I look back, I had them, but it was much more subtle. So there was just behaviors and decisions I made that were unexplainable, and also unexplainable that I was like, had so much energy. It was like impossible to sleep and a million ideas. I was just like going a mile a minute, and I was talking so fast that it was almost, so just things that were obviously not regular for me. So that's how that happened. And then if you experience mania, you inevitably plummet into a depressive period that's unavoidable. So that happened too. And it was really, really severe to the point where I couldn't work. Susceptibility to gravity, the title of those flags, I can point to that just as a example. That phrase comes from a teacher I had in a class for folks with bipolar that I went to when I was recently diagnosed. And that was his definition for how to measure depression, is what is your susceptibility to gravity. And that's actually the best definition I've ever heard, because in one way it's quite poetic, actually. It sounds quite a beautiful way to speak to it, but it's actually literal. And I think if you haven't experienced that level of depression, you don't really understand that it literally is physically hard to move your body through space, which is something that I've experienced. So just as an example. But so it's been a process of learning about this condition, experiencing it within my body, and coming to terms that it's a real thing, because I was always resistant to mental health diagnoses and prescription medication for good reason. We live in an overly medicated society, which is really putting a Band-Aid on the really difficult conditions that we're forced to live within. So I think for the majority, the symptoms of mental health actually aren't from an issue with your brain, but an issue of the conditions that we're asked to live within. But there's some that I think are genuinely of the brain, and one of them is bipolar, and I do believe in medication for that now. I'll just say that also kind of kept me from getting diagnosed faster. But so 2 years ago, I was coming to the idea that I can't help but make work more pointedly about this experience. I want to be part of normalizing speaking about it. I want to be part of that education, again, because it's so stigmatized and people don't really understand what that experience may be. And so I was looking into evolutionary theories of why it even exists, because it's deeply uncomfortable. Like, why does this even exist? Why is this happening to me? And the most compelling thing I found, which isn't necessarily proven to be true, but is quite compelling and possibly is true, is that it might have evolved during the Pleistocene era when the weather was really extreme and shifting. So when the weather was favorable, it would actually be helpful to be quote unquote manic, because you have so much energy, you require very little sleep. Something that I've experienced in other people, you become very creative, actually. So it's great for problem solving. You can kind of make connections really quickly between things and people, and how people's skills relate to each other and how they can function better together. So these types of things. And then when the weather is bad, you would completely shut down and conserve energy, i.e. depression. That one I find a bit more questionable, because the experience of being actually really, really depressed and anxious and paranoid and all these other symptoms doesn't really, to me, seem that functional. But the idea that you would shut down and conserve energy does make sense. All to say, I thought that was interesting because it points to the fact that this condition might have actually been a useful adaptation for a collective survival. So there might be some wisdom held in what we see as neurodivergence or difference. And that to me is really exciting because I think that's a conversation we need to have. And it's starting in terms of, more awareness around things like ADHD, for example, which I also have, but I don't find affects my life as much. But there's some superpowers to it in a way because you can like hyper focus and kind of leap beyond a few steps in the process of learning something or doing something or creating something. So I feel like this conversation is evolving, but I want to be part of that. And for me, the series bipolar is also interesting because we find ourselves in another period of climate crises, of course. So it's more poignant to kind of consider that theory now, given the state we find ourselves in our environment. So yeah, I think for me, the most compelling art that you can connect to requires you to be extremely honest. And that's also just how you connect, on an interpersonal level between humans, is you can only really truly connect with each other through vulnerability and honesty. So I have just felt that finding ways to kind of express what I've been experiencing or learning about through my artwork feels really, really important and gives me motivation to make the work.
Yeah, I love that you shared that. And thank you for being so generous with that response and kind of going deep into your personal history and story about living with and experiencing being bipolar. I think one of the things that's coming up for me, and there's just, again, like in conversations like this, there's always a million things that I'm like, oh, we could talk about. But I think I'm curious to hear how have, in your experience as an artist, we can talk about Venice specifically, but more generally, your work spans installation and large scale works. And I'm reading a little bit about, and I'm looking at some previous exhibitions that you've done with, working with paper, working with textiles, working with sculpture. What has been some of the response from audiences and viewers? Maybe the things that have been most interesting, again, most surprising, or even the overwhelming feedback that you get when people talk to you about your work? Do you tend to hear some of the same things again and again and again? And if so, what are some of the things that people say?
There's a few things that people kind of tend to hone in on. One is a subject matter that we've been discussing. Another is the material process and that history, which holds a lot of as well. So maybe I'll be a bit more brief because we're talking more about the mental health thing already. But one body of work, of which one of the pieces is in the Venice Biennale, is this series where I'm mapping out the graph of the prevalence of words showing up over time. So this is data collected that you can find in Google Dictionary. So, for example, the piece that's in Venice, I looked up the word loneliness, and then you can find a graph of that word increasing in prevalence since the 1800s. So I've been purposely choosing words that are kind of pathologized words because that fits with what I'm thinking about, of course. And loneliness, I think, was a very important choice because there is an epidemic of loneliness that's well documented. And it's also something that's very taboo to speak about, which then makes you even more isolated. But when I think about loneliness, I don't just think about physically actually being alone and not spending time with people, but actually the experience of not being able to embody your full self. So even if you're around people, you are still lonely because you're not actually feeling connected, which I've experienced both of. And that piece in particular, I find people it brings out people wanting to kind of express themselves and connect around this. It's kind of like, oh, I have a chance to talk about this now. And I've had people write me privately, like direct messages as well for those types of works. I'm also working a lot more in Japan, which was a goal for me. I'm half Japanese, so it's a nice way to explore connections to my heritage, which I didn't really have access to growing up in Canada. I'm the third generation. And there, it's even more taboo, any kind of experience of mental health or expressing it. And so I've been written privately from people saying, thank you for this work. It really connects with me and I have no one to talk to about this. Not that I can be the person to talk to everyone about it, but I think it's just you want to say it out loud and it's a chance to say it out loud. So that's exciting to me because I'm still a foreigner there, even though I have some ancestry there. And I think I'm therefore provided a bit more, I don't know what the word is, but I think I have more of a position that I can occupy where I can talk about these things if I'm not actually from there. So that's been exciting to me to explore that. And I'm participating in another biennial, actually, which is exciting, in September in Japan, the washi biennial. It's the inaugural biennial. And so I'll continue to explore how I can incorporate these conversations into the work I'm making. But the other thing that people respond to a lot about in my work, which I find exciting, is the material. So the material is also an example of this embodied knowledge that I'm a marginalized embodied knowledge that I'm really interested in talking about, because making traditional crafts, and this one being traditional paper, which is, a history of over 1,000 years in Japan, but it dates back to over 2,000 years deriving from practices from China. It requires an intimate relationship with one's environment and a caretaking of that environment over many generations. And to create the paper too, you have to engage all of your senses. So you have to be really connected to your body. And while things became more industrialized to the point where now we're actually just so disconnected from our body and mostly living cerebrally, doing work with a computer, textiles are manufactured without us, versus backstrap weaving, where you have to use your entire body even to lift the threads up of the cloth that you're making. So in traditional paper making, you have to be able to hear the viscosity of the water. You have to feel the tension in your body, and you have to engage with the soil and prune the plants, et cetera, et cetera. So it's this deep connection to nature and embodied knowledge that is actually, again, more important than ever because we find ourselves in this environmental crisis, but yet it's things that are being ignored. So people get really interested in the material itself because it looks like fabric, because there's this methodology that I learned where you starch it with konyaku and you kind of massage it into the paper, which makes it more flexible and strong for sewing. So people think it's fabric, but then you walk by it and it really blows. It's so delicate and light, but it's actually quite strong. But people are then they take a second to look and realize it's actually not fabric. And the other thing that's really important to me is craftsmanship. I just deeply appreciate and admire when things are made with great care, and it's clear that that skill was honed over, a very long period of time of taking care of how you're making something. So people often remark on that. So the works that are sewn and very carefully sewing them together and changing thread color and really being intentional. And people can see that only when they see it up close. And then I also make wearables sometimes, which end up being shown as sculptures, but they're also activated through collaborative performances like dance and drumming. So that's always surprising to people that these wearable pieces are actually made out of paper. And the other works that I'm making, like the piece that I was mentioning, it's called Plot Lines and Loneliness, that charts the use of the word loneliness. That's a different body of work where I'm taking these 9 by 9 inch handmade papers that are made intentionally for those pieces and attaching together these tiny tabs of paper at the back. So you can see through the cracks, and it really honors the inconsistent decal edge of handmade papers. So it's very honorific of these practices. And I find that people often respond well to that. And it's very important for me too. I always credit, if I haven't been the one to make the paper, which sometimes I do, I work a lot with Tatsuyuki Kitaoka, who's a master paper maker in Kochi, and Kashiki Seishi is a family mill in Kochi as well, where I did a residency and was farming with them, pruning, cutting down the plants. I learned the whole process, and I'm very much indebted to them, and I continue to use their paper. So I always make sure that people hear about that, and I find that's of interest to people as well.
I love that. A final question as we round out the episode. We're at 25 minutes, but we usually go like anywhere between 25 and 30. We have a tendency in our field to always ask each other what's next. It always happens. And sometimes it means that you can't relish in what is. And I often think about how important it is just to be able to sit with what you've done as opposed to be always looking forward. But in line with a little bit of the forward line of questioning, is there anything artistically, and I'm sure there are many, but whichever you'd like to share, is there anything artistically that you haven't done yet, that you haven't engaged in, potentially a way of making or collaborative types of projects? Is there anything you're really excited to do as an artist that you haven't done yet?
That's such a great question. I feel like there's so many things that I want to do. One thing that's really exciting to me now is I started a short documentary series with my friend and collaborator, Johnny, about traditional papermaking. And so we actually met because he did a short doc about me when I originally did the residency at Kashiki Seishi in Japan. And then we went to Vietnam. And we chose that first because he's Vietnamese Canadian and he'd never been and just felt like a special place to start. And from our impression too, it was a place that traditional papermaking was in even more dire straits. So we really wanted to go and find out why and what was happening there. Just quickly to that, the discovery we found is that the traditional paper that was made for like traditional paintings and printmaking was what was really needing desperately to be rejuvenated and energy put into. But there's also paper that's made for spiritual practices, like altars and burning, different ceremony that was, yes, diminishing a bit, but was in way better shape because it was connected to spirituality, which was something really beautiful to find out about. That was very different than what we were learning about in Japan. So we have plans to continue that learning, and we want to go to Korea next, and then of course China as the originator of paper, and then just continue. So that's something that's been on my mind because it's really hard to make time for things that can, it's very related to what I'm doing, and I want to expand my research. I've engaged with washi for way longer, since 2009, and it's very special to me, but I want to broaden my understanding of the craft globally. So that's been on my mind. It's hard to make time for it, but we have to do it. What else do I do? I'm interested in doing more sculptural work. I've done some pieces, like I said, 2 of them that are in the Venice Biennale. But that's a direction I want to go into more, is space and dimension and pushing the medium further in that way as well. So those are two things that I'll say for now.
Nice. I love that. I think we got it. So I'll just do the exit part of the episode, and then I'll ask you to just stay on for a second so the file can download. But this was great. I mean, you see how easy that was? Like,
No, that was lovely. I know I said I don't ramble, but then I went ahead and rambled. So,
which I thought was really, I was like, Alexa must be comfortable because it's just flowing. There's no glitch. There's no, can you get me through this little step? You are great.
it's funny because I guess in retrospect, you always think of, oh, there's all these things I would have said, but obviously you can't cover anything. But oddly, a very important thing to my work, which maybe we talked about, is that I spent over a decade mostly doing community projects in Nunavut in the Arctic with my friends, and territory of Canada, which really influences my work. And I didn't even talk about it once because I think it was just like too much to explain this period of time. But that's the only thing I thought was funny I didn't talk about. But otherwise, I think it's because we already have chatted that I feel comfortable.
Totally.
Yeah.
For sure. I mean, and that having that baseline really makes a big difference because there's this familiarity that comes out of already having established a connection with someone in some degree. And we're building that in real time, but this is an opportunity to extend some of that. And if it's okay with you, this little blooper that you added about the community work, I mean, I can keep that in because then it'll
Sure.
be on the recording and then people can hear it, which I think would be nice.
Okay. Sure. That sounds good. Yeah. I didn't have a chance to officially say thank you as well for having
So
me. I'm really honored. And like I said, I really admire your podcasts, and being a good interviewer and host is an incredible skill. So I was really excited to do that.
thank you, Alexa. I'm so glad that you made the time and that we were able to do it together. But I'm going to say thank you for joining me, and then you can say it on the recording so at least it's
Okay.
on wax. Alexa Hatanaka, thank you so much for joining me on an episode of Everything is Connected. I really enjoyed chatting with you today.
I really enjoyed it too, and I'm super grateful for being involved. I am an admirer of your podcast, your interviews, and your hosting ability is really exceptional. And I just really love chatting with you in general. So thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure.
That was my episode with Alexa Kumiko Hatanaka. If you enjoyed this episode, consider supporting our work by becoming a subscriber. When you subscribe to Lightwork, you support the work of contemporary artists and the insightful and impactful conversations that I have with them as we investigate art, culture, and society. You support a female founder and a Black entrepreneurship at a time when our government and private corporations continue to eradicate DEI efforts. Subscribe to our Substack and you'll receive exclusive information and resources about each episode, behind-the-scenes content, and more. And remember, follow Lightwork across social platforms for more insights into the inner world of contemporary artists and thought leaders shaping culture.